So we have set up these three properties in our JS file. Let's go ahead and update them on the template. So I'm just doing a one-on-one mapping where object ID that I've defined in my object API name that I've defined in my JS file, I'm mapping it to the object API name, and case record ID that I've hard coded here, I'm just passing it to the record ID here. Since it is not a value but an expression that I'm passing, so that is why I'm putting curly braces here. Same is the case for the fields. I am asking the system to get me these three fields. So since it is a property that I'm passing here, I'm just enclosing in the curly braces here. So we have done with our process here. What is one last thing that is pending? We just need to update this section. So copy it from a place where you know the targets that have been set. I'm just updating my meta.xml file with the targets where this component can be used. So all set for this component to be deployed. So let's go ahead and deploy this component and see the output once we add this component on our case record page. Our component got deployed. Let's go back to our Salesforce org. I'm going to the case record page builder so that I can add this component onto the record page so that we can see that output. So here is that component. I'll just add it here. Go ahead and refresh this case record that we were using for our testing purpose. So that is where I see this component coming up. Now, what exactly is happening here? If you see here, we have asked for three fields. Three fields are origin, status field, and subject field. Now we see those three fields displaying on this component. Yes, our component is not having this styling, just like our previous component. We have not added that in a lightning card. That is fine, but we are mostly focused on the functionality here. Now, what is the other thing that we can notice? It is also bringing values. What are these values coming? Where are these values coming from? These values are coming from a record that we have specified in our component. So what is that record ID? If I go back to my JS file, that is where you'll get to know the hard-coded ID that I was using. So this is the hard-coded ID. If I go back to the case record and see that ID, this is the same ID that I've hard-coded. So this ID that I have here is matching with the record ID that I am on. Right? So this is the same record here. So that means whatever the values that I'm seeing are coming from this record. So if I scroll down and validate these changes, validate this information, they should be same. Case origin is email, which is matching. Case subject is working, which is also working, which is also matching. Last but not the least, we have case subject as hello1, which is also reflected here. Now, one more interesting thing is available for us. I have an option to edit this component as well. If I click on edit, it is giving me option to make some changes. Editing from lightning record form. So I'm just doing it from the record form. That is why I'm just updating the subject like this. Now I also have a save and cancel button. If you remember the discussion that we have for the record form from the documentation, it provides the save and cancel button for us. So that way I can update or create a record accordingly. Right? Since I am using an existing record, this save button would act as a update on this record. Let's click on this one and see what would happen. If you see, currently the subject is set to hello1 on this case record. Let's click on save and see what would happen. It got updated here. What happened to this subject here? If you see, it is also getting updated. So this also talks about the LDS that is running behind the system. Whenever there is an update that is happening, whenever there is a change in the field value, it also gets reflected on the other components as well. In case if I have to show you one more thing, if I change the subject to escalated and click on save, my status has been used here. And also here is also a place where my status field has been reflected on the case. So let's see what would happen if I click on save. This component got updated as well. So even though this is a highlight panel and this is a case record detail and this is my LWC component which is initiating that update, all the components were successfully able to update this information. So this is the beauty of working with your LDS, where a change in one place is also being shared across all the other places as well. Brings us to the end where we have looked at how exactly a record form is behaving. It is helping us with the view form initially. Then if I click on edit, I have the ability to make the changes on the record and save that changes. Now, I just wanted to show you one more thing. If I go ahead and open any other record, initially I was working with 8.5 as in record case record, this one, and I have opened 8.2 record. Even in this place also, I'm seeing the same subject details that are coming from 1085 case record. It is not getting the details that are there on the case. Why is it so? The reason for that one is when I go to my VS Code, I've hard-coded this ID. Right? So that is the reason why, irrespective of whichever case record that I open, I see the case 1085 details here. Now the requirement here is, if I open case number 1082, it should display those details. If I open 1085 or whichever record that I open, that detail should be reflected here. That means I need to dynamically get this ID into my component. How do we do that? What are the things that are needed is something that we'll discuss in our next section. In the previous section, we have talked about the issue that we are facing. Because of we hard coding the ID, every time whichever case record that I open, 1085 details are coming up. It is not dynamic. Our component that we have created is not dynamic. Next task that is there in our hand is to fix this issue. How do we fix it? Right. So here, what is happening? Just because I've hard coded this ID, every time it is picking up this ID to display this record form. So it is loading that record ID because the ID is specified here. Now, how do I convert this static, or how do I convert this hard-coded ID so that it can understand what is that record on which it is present and accordingly display that information? Let's make one change. Since I do not want this, I'll comment out this line. And what I'll do, I'll write record ID here. For this property that I'm creating, I'll add a decorator called API. We have used this API as a decorator in our previous exercise, where if the parent wants to communicate to the child, that is where we'll expose a property with a decorator called API. So I'm doing that here. Since I'm using an API as a decorator here, I also need to import it. That is why LWC component was throwing an error. So I'll just fix that. Now, since I'm using a record ID here and there is no case rec as in a property that has been used, I'll go ahead and update this section as well. I'll say that as record ID here. Now let's go ahead and deploy this one and see the changes. Right, so our component got deployed. What is the only change that we did? Instead of we hard coding this ID, we have used a decorator called API. And to this property called record ID, we have added the decorator. In the template, in the HTML template, we have updated that case record. Instead of using case rec, we have updated with record ID for this attribute called record ID. that is the change that we have done. We have deployed the changes. Let's go back to our Salesforce org, to our component, do a hard refresh. On 1085 record, I still see the changes that I was looking at earlier, which is good. If I open 1082 record, this time I see a different thing happening here, which basically is bringing the values that are there on this record. If you see, the case origin is set to email, case status is set to new, and the case subject is set to hello. I can see these details here. If I open any other record, so let's say if I open this 1002 record, it is getting the subject from this case record and also the status set to new, case origin set to web. If I check for case origin, here it is. Now what is happening dynamically, that record ID property that I was using in my JS file is able to pick up this record ID and pass it to the record form that we have. So all of this is happening because of we exposing this record ID with the API as a decorator. Now who is handling everything? Salesforce is handling everything, where if I use this record ID and expose it as @API, that is where this LWC is smart enough to pick the record ID from the page where it has been added, and it would reflect that changes on the component. So I am not passing any ID here. If you see, this property is not been set. Now who is setting this property? It is taken care by the setup that we have in Salesforce, where this record ID is being set. Let's see if this object API is also being set by Salesforce itself. This object API name, do we need to explicitly pass this value, or can I do something like this? All right, let's go ahead and give it a try. I'll expose another attribute called object API name. Object API name. And I'll not pass this value here. Right, so we were setting this case object API and passing it to this attribute called object API name, which should be the object API for that particular object that we are intended to display that record. Instead of doing that, what I'll do, I'll pass this property that has been exposed as @API. So let's see if the behavior is something that we have seen, or is it changing because of this change that we have added. If I go ahead and do a hard refresh here, my component is working. Let's go ahead and check for few more records to see if there is any change that we see. So everything is working as expected here. The case origin is set to phone and case status is set to new, and there is no subject. Same thing has been reflected. Now who is doing this one? Salesforce, and this component itself is smart enough to pick up on which record this component is added on. So it is picking up the object API name from there and also record ID from the record where it has been added. So if you see here, we have added it on the case. So that is why these values are being set, and we are able to look at that case record information. So that is the advantage of using your @API and this property called record ID, which would get the record ID from the record page where it has been added, and similarly it would get the object API name. Right, just to do some testing in terms of seeing if this is actually working, what I'll do on this component, instead of directly displaying this record form, I know it is working fine. I just wanted to test if it is actually returning the values, or is it something that is working because of the previous changes that I've added. So I've removed the component on the page. And what I'll do, I'll just display this information. First one is our object API name. So I'll just add a break statement, so that way the next element comes in a new line. And what I'll do, I'll say record ID. I'm just printing these values to see whatever that we have seen is something that has been handled by the. I just wanted to validate if whatever that we have seen is a behavior that has been expected. So I'll just save these changes. What we did, we have removed the lightning record form. We have just added the object API name and the record ID here. Just to make sure our component is looking good, let's also add the lightning card, which we were using from the start, to get that UI, get that background around our component. Lightning card, title, record form. Because we are using a record form, that is why I'm adding the title here. And where should my lightning card should end? It should end here. At this point of time, we have not added the record form. I've commented out. I'm just doing it so that I can understand if this is actually working or not, right? So what should happen if I add this component on a case object? This value should be returning case, and this value should be returning the ID for that case, record ID for that case. If I go ahead and add this component on any other object, it should return that object name followed by that record ID. Let's go ahead and test that out. I'll deploy this change. Go back to our org. Do a hard refresh. I'm expecting a lightning card with a title as record form, and there should be two values. The first object API name is giving case, and it is giving the ID that we see here, which is matching with the record ID that I am on. If I pick up any other case record, the ID is getting updated. So that means the record ID @API record ID is working as expected. But how do I confirm that this object API name that is coming as case is something that has been picked up from this record on which this component is added? So let's go to the opportunity object. Open any record here. Here I've not touched this object for a while, right? We have not added any components here. Let's go ahead and edit this page where I'll add this component to see if the object API name is returning opportunity on this object or not, on this page or not, on the record page or not. I'll go ahead and search for our component, which is working with the database component. I'll drag and drop it onto the right-hand side. Click on save, go back to the test opportunity that we have, do a hard refresh. Right, we have not activated this page. Let's quickly do that activation part as well. I'm asking the system to set this record page that I'm seeing as a default record page to the entire org, and do a hard refresh this time, which should be updating the component. If you see here, we have used the same record form. It is able to successfully get the object API name where it has been added, and it is also able to successfully get the record ID. We have tested it on the standard component. Does this behavior also work on our custom object? I have a custom object called, object B. Let's see if this is also working on the custom object B as well. So let's go ahead and edit that record page. What I wanted to do, I want to add that component onto this page. Add that component. activate this page. I'm assigning as a default record page for all the people in this org for this object. So once that change is done, do a hard refresh on the record. You should be able to see the object name for this object and the record ID. Just to confirm, if I open the object detail page for this object P, this is the API name for that particular object. Whatever that I'm seeing here is the same thing that has been displayed here as well. What does this exercise basically help us understand? This exercise that we have done was able to help us confirm one point, which is nothing but whenever I use @rate API as a decorator to this variables record ID and object API name, it is smart enough to get the record ID in which this component is added. Same is the case with your object API name. It gets the object API name for that particular record where this component is added. So if it is added on the case, it brings us the case, which is the object API name for the case object. If it is added on a custom object, it would go ahead and get the API name for that custom object. So going forward, in case if you want to display a record form, instead of hard coding the values, what you can do, you can use these two properties with this decorator API to get the details and display your record form. So if I uncomment this code and remove this one, since our testing is done, if I remove it, or I can simply comment this out. So that way it doesn't come up on the UI. Now, what does this component would do? This component basically gives me the case record. If this form is added on the case record, it would go ahead and give me the case record object API name. So if I add this component on the case, this object API name would be coming as case, and this would be coming dynamically on which record that I'm opening. And followed by this fields that I have is something that I'm declaring. So if I deploy this component, there might be chances that these fields might not be valid for other objects. These fields are something that is there on the case, but these are not valid for a object B that I've shown you. The fields are very specific to the case object. I'll go ahead and remove it in the other places so that way we do not end up seeing any errors once we open this objects. Right, so I'm saving this one. Similarly on the object also, I'll just revert this changes. On the case page, I'll still keep this changes handy. Now you might be thinking, why am I doing it? Because the component that I've designed is very specific for a case. How do I make it dynamic? Now, since we already know the output here, let's deploy this component once more so that we have the latest changes and we see that it is working on the case object as we have. Let's see if it is working on the case object as per our requirement. Do a hard refresh. You should be seeing 3 fields with a card which says record form as a title. So it is working as designed. What if I want all the fields that are there on this page layout? How do I get it? What if I want the fields that are added on the page layout on this component? That is one. What if I want to display only fields that are mentioned in this highlight panel? How can I do that? Let's look at that piece to see how can we make those changes. Now what I need to do, I should have an ability to show all the fields that are added on this page layout in this component. That is one. Second one is, what if I want to only get this fields that are there in this highlight panel? Now, if I go back to the documentation, there are some specifications that we can leverage. What are those? We have looked at fields. We have looked at object API name. We have looked at record ID. What are the other things that we can explore? There is an option called layout type. What it does, what exactly this attribute would do? The type of layout to use to display the form fields. Possible values are compact, Another one is a full. When creating a record, only a full layout is supported. So it is saying that you have two options. One is compact, another one is full for this attribute called layout type. So let's copy this attribute. Go ahead and make a change on the HTML page to see what exactly the difference it would bring to the table. I'm switching to my VS Code here, going to the HTML file, going to the HTML template. I have fields, the last attribute that I've written. I'll just extend that by saying layout type as full, because I know that it takes either compact or full as a value. I've just made that change, and I'm not interested in this fields at this point of time. Let's remove it, save these changes, and deploy this component. We have removed the fields that we have specified, and we have added one more attribute which says layout type is equals full. Our changes got deployed. Let's go back to our Salesforce org, do a hard refresh, and see the differences. If you see here, all the fields that I have mentioned on this page layout are present here. Internal comments, description, subject are those last fields. Internal comment, description, and subject. And what else we have? We have last modified by, last modified date, SLA violation, potential liability. All the fields that I'm seeing on the page layout are being present here. There is another attribute called columns. How many columns does the Salesforce needs to use to display this information? Let's go and set that attribute as well, and I'll set that value as 2 here. Since it is a count, so I'm just putting it as a number here because the documentation says it is a number. Specify the number of columns for your form. So I've just mentioned it as 2 here in my HTML template. Save these changes, deploy the latest changes to our org. Go ahead and go to your Salesforce org, do a hard refresh. This time, if you see, it exactly mimics what I see on this record detail page. Now, why is it not doing earlier? By default, that column value is set to 1. That is why all the fields that I am displaying here is coming in a single line. Since I've set it to column 2, it is displaying them in 2 columns here. So that is the advantage of playing around with your attributes where you can achieve things. So we have set the layout value as full. Let's see what would happen if I change that value to compact. If you see here, the layout type is set to full or compact. We have tested the full value. Let's see what would happen if I set that value to compact here. I'm again going back to my org. Remove the attributes that I've added as column. Only change this layout type is equals compact. Deploy these changes once more. If I go back to my Salesforce org, do a hard refresh, I see only few fields. One is the subject, other one is priority, third one is status, and fourth one is case number. So what it is picking up, it is picking up the fields that are added in your highlight panel or a compact layout. So whatever that has been configured there, so that information is displayed in this section. So that is how you can make use of either displaying all the fields or only display the fields that are there in your compact layout or your highlight panel. How did we do that without providing the fields? We have done that using the layout type. Layout type is equals compact to show the fields that are there on the compact layout. When the value is set to full, it is displaying all the fields that are present in our page layout. As a best practice, it is always recommended to display whatever the fields that you need rather than asking our component to display all the fields that we have. If your requirement demands so, feel free to do it. If not, specify the fields that you are looking for and mention them in the array, pass it to your Lightning record form so that way it loads that record. Now, if I go back to the documentation one last time, to show you one more attribute that we have that we can play around with, which is mode. So mode as an attribute, what it does, it specifies the interaction and display the style for the form. Possible values are view, edit, and read only. If the record ID is not provided, the default mode is edit, which displays a form to create a new record. If the record ID is present, the default mode is view, and which would display the fields with the edit icon on the updatable fields. Right, so let's play around with mode as an attribute. If I go ahead and write the mode here and specify the value as read only. Let's see how does the component would look like. Before me deploying these changes, let's go to the Salesforce org and see what is the current look and feel of our component. So if you see here, I see a pencil icon here. Right? What would happen if I deploy this component? Remember, we have made a changes on the fields that we are displaying and also on the mode. So we are expecting the three fields that we have defined in our JS file: origin, case, and subject. And let's see if we are able to see that pencil icon or the edit symbol at the end of the field. So let's deploy this change. And once the deployment is successful, go back to our Salesforce org to a refresh here. Now, if you see here, I do not see an option to edit these fields. The reason why it is happening is because I've marked that component as a read only. How did I do that? By using the mode. If I change this mode to edit, save this one, deploy these changes once more, go back to our Salesforce org, do a refresh, you would see these fields now in the form of edit page. So if I click on edit on any of these fields, this is how it looks like. It is mimicking the same thing here. All right. So in case if you have set the mode to view, it would display the way that it was showing up earlier. If I do a hard refresh once more, you would see that change. It would resemble the way it was showing up earlier. Right, so this is how you would reuse your record form and its attributes. One last thing that we can specify here is, in case if I do not specify the record ID, let's say I want to create a new record. What would happen if I do this? And I'll also remove this mode here. I'll just specify only the object name and the fields. Right, so let's say what would happen if I deploy this component. I've specified only the object API name and the fields as an attributes for this record form. Let's see what would be the behavior of our component. If I load this component, this time it is coming in an edit mode because it doesn't know which record ID information it has to fetch. Since it doesn't know, it is asking us to go ahead and create a new record with this information. Record form is what I'll write and click on save. Now what happened? There is a form that got updated. Now does it actually created a record? Let's check that out. So if everything goes fine, there should be a case record that should be created with this subject as test from Lightning record form. Let's go back to the case tab and see if we have that record. So if you see here, earlier I had only 1085 record as a last record. Now I see 1086 record, and that record got just created now. So it just got created, and both the created by last modified by fields are showing the same date time. So that means there are no changes that are done on that record, and it got just created now because it is matching with my local time. All right, so that is how you would use your record form to ask the users to create a record for you. If you do not provide a record ID in your Lightning record form, that is where it would act like a form to create a new record. If you provide a record ID into your record form, that becomes your edit form, where it would provide an option for the users to update that case record that you have specified. So that brings us to the end of this video, where we have used record form and also looked at the attributes that we can try out in terms of the way that it looks and feels like. Interesting that we have noticed is we have not written any Apex controller or a single Apex code in terms of saving the record or updating the record. All we did was we have used the base component that is built on top of our LDS, which is helping us display that record or update that record depending on our attributes that we are setting in our record form. In the previous video, we have looked at how exactly we can start working with our data. We have seen record form, a base component that is built on top of our LDS, that is helping us display the record in the way that it is being set in our Lightning component. Depending on the attributes values that I'm passing, it is changing its behavior. If the record ID is being specified, it is acting like an update on that record. If the record ID is not being specified, it is asking the end user to create a new record. If I specify the view mode as read only, it is just displaying that information and the user is not able to edit that record. If I specify the mode value as edit, it provides the UI like this, where the user can edit that record. If I provide the mode as view, it is looking like this, where I have an edit icon on the fields that are editable or updatable. Now let's understand what are the other base components that are available for us, where I can play around with these records. If I go to the documentation, when I search for record, we have talked about three things that are coming up: record edit form, record view form, and record form. Record form is something that we have already looked at. Let's shift our focus to record view form. And also one more point that I wanted to call out as a point that you can keep in mind is, when you're working with Lightning Web Components, look for this section where you can use that components. When you're working with Aura, look for this section. Do not mix and match this component, so that way you might end up seeing the desired results that has been displayed as an example in this documentation. We have looked at record form. Now let's shift our discussion to record view form and see how is this different from our record form.